there's no bells today, as you've probably noticed for the past couple of weeks. So, as always, here's the deal. And this is kind of interesting. I talked with my second period class about this yesterday. It was really kind of interesting because up on the board, Mr. Fiskin, for you all, had written, please put away phones and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, it might have been somebody in here, but I don't remember. But anyway, somebody commented, oh, it's nice that you wrote that up there, because I was getting tired of hearing it. And of course, the irony is, we've been saying the same thing, right? Mr. Fiskin and I, and probably a lot of your teachers all year. So those of you who don't immediately walk into a classroom and put away your phone, get out something to write with and write on, and like close your Chromebook, you're why we have to keep giving those reminders. I will tell you, I don't mind it at all. It doesn't bother me in the slightest to walk in here and say the same like minute and 30-second at most spiel every day. But I will suggest that one of the skills that some people kind of missed out on during the pandemic / middle school, I don't know what's a bigger disaster for education, the pandemic or the way that we generally approach middle school in this country. But, right? But not your teachers, by the way. I have nothing but respect for the teachers and staff at Shelburne and Linus Pauling. It's the way we approach middle school as a country. It's the way that we do it. We reinforce a lot of the wrong things. And as a result, you all who are intelligent, you're creative, you're naturally interested in what's going on, and you have the capability of being highly skilled in a lot of areas. Some of you already are, but all of you, like you are essentially without limit right now in terms of your skills. But because of the way that we do middle school and because of the pandemic, some of you walk into a classroom and don't immediately get out something to write with, write on, and put away your electronics. Super interesting. I teach a college class at OSU in the summers, most summers. I'll probably teach one this summer, I'm not sure yet, but in that class, I don't say anything. I just walk in, and at 10 o'clock, I start teaching. And if they are on their phones or not there yet, or watching cat videos on their laptops, or they don't have something to write with or write on, like, whatever. It's a brave new world. But anyway, I don't mind reminding you, but I think it's good for you to think, like, oh, wait a second. I don't need a reminder. Like, you already know. So, if you haven't done so already, earbuds. Okay. And if you've got a Chromebook out, close it. If you have an agreement with somebody here on staff, like an adult, a teacher, or administrator, that you do not have to write stuff down, just listen. But if you don't have that agreement, you should have paper and pencil, and you should be writing down the usual stuff, which is anything that I underline, anything that I handwrite, or anything that I draw. So everybody needs paper, pencil, something to write with, something to write on in front of them. And what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at a couple things. The first thing we're going to do is revisit natural selection, just to kind of reinforce it. You already talked about it, but what I want to do is reinforce a couple of things about natural selection, kind of address some misconceptions, and then we're going to launch into something that's really kind of crazy. And we'll come back to some of these questions at the end. But I have a question for you. So when it comes to Darwin's finches, here is what Charles Darwin saw when he went on his voyage in the 1800s. He went to the mainland of South America, and he saw a bird, a finch. And then he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he saw a bunch of different birds, all finches. And we talked about adaptive radiation. We talked about, a little bit about natural selection as it involves all those organisms. But my question to you is, if the finches on the islands evolved from the finch on the mainland, then why did he still see birds on the mainland, right? Like, let's think about Pokemon for a second here. How many of you know at least a little bit about Pokemon? Raise your hand.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, right? Who's your favorite? Pikachu, right?
No, my old favorite. I don't do Pokemon. I used to like surfing Pikachu.
Yeah, I don't know any of them. But here's something interesting. If you start with a basic Pokemon, and then you evolve it, that critter turns into a different critter. The original is gone. So how does that work with evolution? I mean, if that finch in South America turned into a bunch of other finches, then how do we still have the original one there? Alex, what were you thinking?
I mean, to go with the Pokemon thing, you can still find not evolved Pokemon in the wild. But also, it's just the fact that there's two different areas. Like, they evolved in the Galapagos Islands, and Finchie stayed on the mainland, so we didn't have to change that.
Yeah, so part of the answer to that question is there were two groups, right? And then there's another part of the answer to that question, which it involves a potential misconception that I want to address with natural selection and a new process called speciation. And here's what's kind of interesting about speciation. We're not going to get into this today, but we will at some point talk about this because it's interesting. And we're going to do it in a non-argumentative, non-confrontational way. But speciation is kind of at the heart of much of the controversy surrounding evolution. There are lots of people in this country, in this state, in this town, in the world, who just do not believe that different species of organisms are related to each other and that those relationships are determined by evolutionary pathways. They do not believe that. And I'm not here to try to convince you one way or the other. Like, your beliefs are your beliefs and your family's beliefs are your family's beliefs. But one of the things that's really interesting is that when people say evolution, often what they mean is speciation. Those are two different but related things. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit today too. And then most of the work today that you're going to be doing is going to be looking at theoretical speciation. And there's a reason that you're going to be looking at theoretical speciation that we'll talk about. Okay, so we're going to briefly revisit natural selection. Most of what I'm about to tell you, you've heard already, so I'm not going to ask you to write a bunch of stuff down. What I want you to do is just think about what I'm talking about and really kind of think critically about what I'm talking about. Try to take it apart in your brain and put it back together. So we'll talk about natural selection, and then we're going to talk about some specific predictions about natural selection, including the idea that that may be how speciation occurs. So as a reminder, we have a basic definition. This is the scientific definition of evolution. It's a change in allele frequencies. Frequencies is a mathematical thing. It's the percentage. But actually, we often just think about it in terms of absolute numbers. So one interesting thing is that we get to define our populations in science. So I can define the population of individuals in this room as being a population of interest. And that means the allele frequencies of the alleles in this room are determined only by the people that are in here. And I can create evolution right before your eyes. Are you ready? I happen to have an allele for something called male pattern baldness. Some of you have it as well. Whether you're male or female, you may have the allele. If you're male and you have it, you'll probably end up losing some or much of your hair. If you're female and you have it, you probably won't know. But you might pass it on to your kids if you have kids. So I can engineer some evolution. Are you ready? Are you watching? Watch carefully. This population is about to evolve. Are you ready? That's it. That was evolution. And that seems really weird, because nothing really happened, except that I defined our population as the individuals in this room. And the allele frequencies are the percentage of, we can think of allele frequencies as being the percentage of us that have a given allele. That's not quite right, but it's good enough for us. When I left, my alleles left with me. The gene, or the allele frequency of the male pattern baldness allele dropped. That's that. So that was evolution. Now that seems kind of stupid, and it is kind of stupid. Nobody cares about that kind of evolution. Mostly what we care about is evolution that is like happening in nature, right? Like it's silly to be like, well, I'm just gonna walk out there and now evolution has occurred. That's silly, but it's scientifically accurate. We don't ever talk about it that way because it's useless. So we're just looking at how many organisms have a certain allele. Really what we're looking at is, out of all the alleles in a population, how many of them are a certain one, right? That's what an allele frequency is. And so in general, in real populations, now there is migration that can occur. Organisms can move into or out of an area. But in general, when we're thinking about evolution, particularly with natural selection, we're thinking about populations changing because of births and deaths. So one of the things that is sometimes misunderstood about natural selection is that it necessarily involves new organisms. So go back to the Pokemon thing. One of the misconceptions about evolution is that an individual evolves, but that can't happen. I'm not going to evolve. None of you are going to evolve. Populations evolve as individuals are born and other individuals die. Allele frequencies change because future generations don't have the exact same alleles as parental generations. So it takes births and deaths for natural evolution to occur. And then when we talk about biological fitness, this, again, you talked about this already, but just as a reminder, this is basically just looking at like how suited is an organism for the environment. There's a couple things that determine biological fitness. One is their alleles, the other is the environment. If alleles change, organisms may be more or less fit because of their alleles. If the environment changes, they may become more or less fit because of the environment. All of you have rich, full heads of hair, and I loathe you for it. But also, you're going to be in a world of hurt in another 20 years. And the reason is because of climate change. It's going to get a lot hotter, and you all are going to be uncomfortable because of your full heads of hair. I'm going to be rocking it because I'm bald and I'm going to stay cool. So you might have thought 20 years ago that being bald was a disadvantage because it makes me a little bit funny looking. Well, the joke's on you. First of all, I'm funny looking anyway. Even when I had hair, I was funny looking. And second of all, I'm going to be the only one to survive the upcoming climate apocalypse because I'm going to be comfortable and cool and you all are going to be hot and miserable. The environment can change or the alleles can change. And so this is kind of what I was talking about with environmental effects on fitness. And then when we talked about natural selection, this is where what we're talking about is a process that changes allele frequencies, because that's what evolution is. But in this case, the process involves organisms being more fit for an environment because of their alleles, which they then pass on to their kids in greater proportion than organisms that don't have those alleles. And it can work in reverse, because there can be harmful alleles or they can be beneficial alleles. And there's no guarantee. I, for example, might have been born with a set of alleles that made me super smart and super strong and super fast and like the best human being ever. But if I get like bitten by a rabid spider and I like pass away, then I don't pass any of those alleles on to my offspring. So there's an element of randomness, but when you have enough individuals, what happens is it's pretty likely that the ones with beneficial alleles will have more babies. Those babies are more likely to have those beneficial alleles. So we generally see an increase over time in the percentage of organisms with those beneficial alleles. That's natural selection. That changes things for populations. You might have a population of finches that over time starts to have a slightly longer beak, or slightly different coloration, or slightly smaller body size. Those are all the kinds of things that we would expect to see in real populations, and in fact we do. There's an organism called the desert pocket mouse, and that's a very well studied organism. That organism generally comes in two colors, and depending on their environment, one or the other of those colors will generally be more abundant. We see evolution happening with the pocket mouse all the time. As they move around and move to new locations, as their habitat changes, generally due to volcanic eruptions, we see that their coloration, the coloration of the populations change. We see natural selection happening all the time, which means we see evolution happening all the time. All right, and so when we talk about natural selection, what we're looking at is the idea that there are alleles that are a better fit for the environment than other alleles that are out there, and the environment itself is what's doing the selecting. It's not a conscious thing. It's not active. It's just, if you happen to have alleles that allow you to survive better in a cold environment, then you'll probably have more kids, and your kids will probably inherit some of those alleles. So if we suddenly were in a really, really cold environment, we would expect to see future generations of people be more and more fit for that kind of cold environment, and that happens with all organisms. There is no end goal to natural selection. The peppered moth that we looked at a little bit in class with a simulation and showed you some pictures and talked about it a little bit, that's a good example, because what happened with the peppered moth is, like in the 1700s, most of those organisms were light colored. In the 1800s, it shifted and most of them became dark colored. And then now it's shifting back to be light colored. It's not like there's a perfect moth and we're moving closer and closer to it. A lot of times people tend to think of us as the pinnacle of evolution, but we are no more and no less evolved than any other organism out there. Even the most basic single-celled bacteria has been evolving for exactly as long as everything else. The evolutionary chain goes all the way back to the first common ancestor. So we're not better, we're not more evolved, we definitely are unique. And that's a pretty cool thing, and I don't mean to deny it, but it's not like evolution was kind of directed toward, we gotta get people, we gotta get people, we gotta get people, and then finally we got people, and it's like, yes, we win. It's more like, we happen to live in a world where it's pretty good to be a people, with our big brains and our, bipedal walking and our opposable thumbs and our ability to vocalize and communicate. And then the other thing to think about is that that natural selection is an entirely undirected process. It just happens, right? So it's kind of like if you play pool and you're trying to get a ball into the hole, then you line up the pool cue and you line up the cue ball and you get everything arranged and you're really trying to get it into the pocket. Evolution is more like you walk up to the pool table, you don't know where anything is, and you just do this with the pool cue. Is it possible that some of the balls are in pockets? Yeah, it is, but it just happens by chance. There's no trying. They're not trying to do anything. Okay, and then what we're really interested in starting today is what happens if natural selection goes on for a really long time. Because if you have changes that involve alleles becoming more common and then less common, and then more common, and then less common, then at any given time, if you look at a population, you'll probably kind of see the same thing. But if, for example, there are environmental changes, or if organisms relocate to a new environment, then, instead of alleles becoming more common and then less common and then more common and then less common, what will happen is really beneficial alleles will become more common. Alleles that aren't so beneficial become less common. And it never flips back. And if that happens with one allele, that's not, you may notice a difference visually between a group of organisms in earlier populations, but you wouldn't necessarily say they're different species. But the more it happens, the more alleles that are involved, the more different the parent organisms, the parent population is from future generations. Which means if we have enough time, we might see some really big differences. And that's where speciation comes in, and this is the new stuff. So speciation is a process. Speciation is a process. We tend to think about speciation as being something that happens really quickly. We tend to think about it as like, well, there's this thing, and then all of a sudden there's this thing, and then all of a sudden there's this thing. Darwin's finches is a good example of that. You go to the South American mainland, you see a finch. If you go to the Galapagos Islands, you see a bunch of specialized finches that look really different. The implication is that it happened fast, but it probably didn't. It's just that the way that we see speciation is through the fossil record. And the fossil record is really not complete. We don't have all the specimens that we could possibly have. Hundreds of thousands or millions of years can go by between the fossilization of two similar individuals in a particular environment. So what it means is that we will see something, and then we'll see a later fossil that really looks dramatically different, but we may not see much in between it. Maybe we'll see a little bit, but not a ton. So it shows up quickly in the fossil record, but it doesn't actually happen quickly. And speciation is the name that we give to the process that causes a new species to emerge. And we really only see this in the fossil record. There's one other place where we can potentially see speciation, and that's with single-celled organisms like bacteria and stuff. The problem with single-celled organisms like bacteria is we can't apply our definition of speciation or of species to those organisms. Because our definition of species were organisms that can reproduce and the offspring are viable. Bacteria don't mate, they just divide. So if I have two bacterial cells and they both divide and they kind of look the same but they're a little bit different, how do we know if they're a different species or not? We don't really. We have criteria. Some people have said that they've seen new species of bacteria emerge. Other people argue with them. We don't have consensus on it. We certainly have never seen species evolve in nature where there is inarguably a difference. We have never seen, for example, crickets and then waited for a long while and then later on came back and they were praying mantises. That's just not anything that any human has ever seen or ever will see, because it takes a really long time, millions of years in most cases. So the way that speciation occurs in general, we think, is because of evolution, specifically through natural selection. So if we're asking, how does this happen? The answer is natural selection. But we already talked about the idea that natural selection is just like changing one little thing or another little thing. But here's what's really cool about natural selection. And I'm going to play this video for you, not today, but next week we can talk a little bit more about speciation. But imagine if I came to you with a baby picture of you. If I brought you a baby picture and I was like, this is you, you'd be like, yeah, that was me. But you don't look like that now. So how did that happen? Well, here's what's really cool about thinking about pictures of you. If you had a picture of you that was taken every day from the moment of your birth right up until today, you would be able to tell the difference between some of the pictures. Like if you had really long hair and then you got a haircut, or if you lost a tooth or something. But for the most part, You would never be able to look at any two pictures and be like, oh, this one came first and this one came second, right? A day apart, you never know. Every single day, you all look pretty much the same. But over the course of even the 160 days that I've known you, you've changed a lot. Like some of you look different now than you did on the first day of school. I don't really, but you all do. And you definitely look different than you did on the first day of school when you were in 6th grade and when you were in kindergarten. Small changes that are imperceptible as they happen can add up to big differences. That's how we think speciation happens. So if we think about groups of organisms and natural selection acting on groups of organisms, if they're the same species but they're in different spots, we can imagine that natural selection is going to operate on each population separately. So for example, if you have 400 finches living on the Galapagos Islands, but they're in different places. You have 70 living over here where there's lots of seeds. You have 70 living on this island where there's lots of flowers that produce nectar. 70 living on this island where there's lots of bugs living in the logs and stuff like that. And what you would expect is that in those different environments, the exact same organisms would have different levels of fitness. If I happen to have kind of a skinny bee, then I'm going to be much better off if I'm living in a place where I can drink nectar out of a flower or get an insect out of a rotting piece of wood. I'm not quite as well off in a place where there are big, hard-shelled seeds that I need to crack open in order to be able to eat. And that's exactly what happened on the Galapagos Islands, and that's the same kind of thing that happened in a number of other places as well. What we need to develop new species is natural selection and time. Those two things are the ingredients. And this is where we're going to skirt the controversy for now, because some of you are thinking, yeah, I know, but no, it doesn't. And a lot of people in this country, in this world, believe that. My job is not to convince you of anything. I don't want to try to persuade you. I'm not trying to sell you my opinion. What I would like for you to do is for you to understand how it could happen. And if you think it did, great. If you don't think it did, that's fine as well. I'm not trying to challenge your belief system. But understanding how something could work is always an interesting exercise. And we can do that in a way that I hope will seem respectful to everyone here. There's a reason that this is worth thinking about and understanding, and we'll talk about it next week. Okay? But basically the reason is that there's a utility to this theory. The theory that speciation could occur through natural selection is a very powerful theory because we can use it to make some predictions. That's a really powerful thing, and that's what science is all about. The way that we are generally going to think about speciation, and there's a lot of ways that can happen, but in general what we think about is kind of these changes that happen over a long period of time, and they add up to differences in the organisms. This bird species here that existed at some previous time, as it reproduced and as older members of the population died, gradual changes, and maybe it took 1 million years, but eventually it changed enough that it's a recognizably different species. So in a given habitat, a population can evolve over time so that descendants are a different species. But that, of course, comes back to the question of, but wait a second, what about the original species? How does that make any sense if we still see the original species like we do for Darwin's finches? And the answer to that is, well, in one habitat, there might be a radical change. In habitat B, it might be that having lighter coloration and some red and generally more colorful, that might be a real advantage for the individuals in that population, these long tail feathers. That makes a lot of sense. But In a different location, it might be that the original organism was really awfully fit. In both cases, we're seeing the same amount of evolution. Both of these organisms have been evolving for the same amount of time. It's just that natural selection wasn't operating as strongly when the habitat wasn't really different. If you have two habitats, natural selection is gonna maximize fitness in both habitats. If one of those habitats stays the same, then we would expect the organisms living in that habitat would largely stay the same. If one of those habitats is dramatically different, then we would expect that the organisms living in that habitat would be dramatically different. And that's what happened with Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches evolved to look really, really different from the parent population because it was a different habitat. The group of finches that Darwin saw on the mainland had been evolving for every bit as long as the organisms that he saw on the islands, but their habitat hadn't changed that much. Genetically, they were probably different. They might have even been considered a different species from the original parent species 1 million years ago or 1.5 million years ago. But they didn't look dramatically different from the way they looked for a long time because the habitat stayed the same. But those exact same species of birds in a different habitat evolved to look really different. So this is how we can kind of explain how it is that we often will see both kind of what we think of as the original species and also a new species. The answer is they're equally advanced. They've been evolving for equally as long. Natural selection has been acting on them for equally as long. But there haven't been as many changes in one of those populations. We just don't see as many changes, and that's it. Okay, let's hear what the Amoeba Sisters have to say about this, because they often have some clarity to add.
So if you've seen our videos before, you may know that one of us is a cat person, while the other one of us is a dog person. And when we were younger, we used to wonder, wouldn't it be cool to have one animal that is half dog and half cat, a dog cat? There was a cartoon we used to watch as a kid about that, although because of our TV reception issues, it never came in very clear. Hence our childhood of instead watching nature shows. As cool as a half-cat, half-dog animal would likely be, we need to understand that cats and dogs are different species. So what is a species? Well, organisms that are in the same species can interbreed, and their offspring can reproduce. That means the huge variety of domesticated dog breeds, they're all the same species, even though they can look very different. Same with domesticated cats. All the different cat breeds are still the same species. You can watch our classification video to learn about the hierarchy levels and taxonomy, but in this video, we're just going to focus on the level of species itself. Now, can two different species breed and have offspring? Yes. For example, let's consider the magnificent zonkey. Yes, it's a thing. It's a hybrid, actually, a cross between two different species, a donkey and a zebra. Pretty rare, but it can happen. They typically are going to be sterile, though. So even though the donkey and the zebra had the baby zonkey, that zonkey will not be fertile. Donkeys and zebras are different species, so this fits into that species rule. Speciation, which means the development of a new species, can occur when populations are reproductively isolated in some form. Why? Well, first, check out our natural selection video, which talks about natural selection as a mechanism of evolution and how change over time can lead to a new species. Our focus right now is to see how isolation can happen in the first place, which can give rise to speciation. If we're going to get a little more fancy, we could talk about two main types of speciation: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And here comes our disclaimer in our short video clip. We are only giving some examples of isolation and how speciation can occur. In allopatric speciation, there's a geographic barrier that separates the populations. So while natural selection is acting on these populations, there is also some geographical barrier, like a river or a mountain, that keeps them from being able to interbreed and share the same gene pool. Eventually, over a period of time, there can be change over time in the separated populations, in their separated areas from mechanisms like natural selection or genetic drift. Over time, these populations can have significant genetic differences that may not allow them to interbreed, even if they were brought together. Populations separated geographically can form different species. You might think you would always need a geographic boundary to separate populations, but in sympatric speciation, the speciation happens in the same area, yet there's something else isolating them. So what is it? Well, it can be a lot of things. We'll talk about just a few of them now. Let's start with pre-zygotic barriers. That means barriers that occur before you can even make a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg, so a pre-zygotic barrier is not even allowing fertilization to happen. So of the pre-zygotic barriers, let's start with this first one, behavioral isolation. This is when species can have different behaviors, even
So,
very slightly.
We're gonna forego this. We'll probably finish this up next week because there's some things that are worth knowing about this. But basically the big idea is that allopatric versus sympatric speciation. You don't need to know vocabulary. And in fact, you don't even really need to think about sympatric speciation. There's a bunch of ways that it can happen. It's kind of neat to think about. But mostly we're gonna keep things simple. We're gonna think about allopatric speciation. That's where groups of organisms cannot reproduce because there's a physical barrier. That makes it easiest to think about. What I'm gonna have you all do today, there's an assignment on Canvas. There's lots of instructions and questions. It's all self-guided. Before we start, let's take a break. So come back in about 5 minutes, and then you can get started working in pairs on the simulation, and I'll kind of coach you as we're going.